It was a warm evening in the small town of Willow Creek. The sun was setting, painting the sky with shades of pink and orange. A gentle breeze moved through the streets, making the trees whisper softly. The little town was peaceful, with people chatting on their porches and children playing on the sidewalks. Down Main Street, 68-year-old Martha Bell walked slowly, carrying a small grocery bag in one hand and leaning on her wooden walking stick with the other. Her silver hair was neatly tied back in a bun, and she wore a plain blue dress with comfortable shoes. To everyone who passed by, she looked like a sweet old lady, just another grandma picking up bread and milk before heading home. People in Willow Creek knew Martha as the quiet widow who lived in the small yellow house at the end of Oak Street. She always smiled kindly, never caused trouble, and often baked cookies for the neighborhood kids. Some people felt sorry for her, thinking she must be lonely without her husband. Others barely noticed her at all. To them, she was just another old woman in town, harmless and fragile. But Martha Bell was not what she seemed. Behind her gentle smile and soft eyes, she carried secrets no one could ever imagine. Many years ago, long before she came to Willow Creek, Martha had been one of the most feared bounty hunters in the entire country. She had chased dangerous criminals, tracked down thieves, and even faced men twice her size. She had traveled across deserts, mountains, and cities, always staying one step ahead of the bad guys. Martha had been known by many names in her past. Some feared her, some respected her. But now, those days were over. She had left that life behind. She wanted peace. She wanted to live in a quiet town where no one knew who she really was. And for a while, she thought she had found it. But Willow Creek, as peaceful as it seemed, had its own troubles. There were whispers about troublemakers in town, strangers on loud motorcycles, stealing from stores and scaring the locals. Martha had noticed them too. She saw how they rode past the diner, laughing loudly and throwing trash on the street. She had watched them glare at people, making them nervous. But she said nothing. She was just an old woman now, and it wasn't her fight. As she walked past the small shops lining Main Street, she heard friendly greetings from the shop owners. "Good evening, Martha," called out Mr. Jenkins, the owner of the bakery. "Got everything you need today?" "Yes, thank you," Martha replied with a warm smile. She continued walking, her footsteps slow but steady. She passed the town's only gas station, where a group of teenagers sat on the curb, sipping sodas and talking loudly. They hardly noticed her as she walked by, just like always. No one ever really paid much attention to Martha Bell. And that was just how she liked it. But deep inside, something in her heart stirred. She couldn't forget the feeling she had whenever she saw those bikers roll into town. She had spent a lifetime reading people, watching their moves, and she could tell they weren't here for anything good. They were trouble. And trouble had a way of finding her, even when she tried to avoid it. Martha sighed softly as she turned onto Oak Street, heading toward her little house. She looked at the homes around her, seeing the warm lights inside and hearing families laughing together. That's why she had come to Willow Creek, to feel safe, to feel at home. Yet, a small part of her still remembered the thrill of the chase. The feeling of adrenaline when she was hunting someone down. the way she could disappear into the night, leaving no trace. As she reached her front porch, Martha paused for a moment. She looked down at her walking stick. To most people, it was just a regular wooden cane, something she needed to help her walk. But inside, it held a hidden secret, something she hadn't used in years. A blade, sharp and ready, hidden away like the memories she tried to forget. She shook her head and smiled to herself. "Those days are gone, Martha," she whispered. "You're just a little old lady now." She stepped inside, closing the door behind her. The house smelled of lavender and fresh bread. She placed her grocery bag on the counter and poured herself a cup of tea, sitting down by the window. Outside, the street lights flickered on, and the town grew quiet. But deep down, Martha knew that peace like this never lasted forever. And maybe, just maybe, the quiet old lady everyone thought they knew would have to show them who she really was one last time. The town of Willow Creek was usually quiet. People liked it that way. The streets were calm, and everyone knew each other. But that evening, something changed. A loud noise filled the air, making people turn their heads. It was the sound of motorcycles, big, roaring machines that shook the ground as they sped down Main Street. A group of bikers, dressed in black leather jackets with skulls and flames on the back, rode into town like they owned the place. Their engines growled, their laughter echoed, and their heavy boots thudded against the pavement as they pulled into the gas station. People at the gas station froze. Mr. Jenkins, who owned the bakery across the street, peeked out of his shop window. Mrs. Thompson, filling her car with gas, quickly got back inside and locked her doors. The town wasn't used to trouble, and these men looked like nothing but trouble. But Martha Bell kept walking. She didn't hurry. She didn't change direction. She didn't even glance their way. Her old, steady hands gripped her walking stick tightly as she made her way toward the gas station, just like she did every week. The biggest biker, a man with a long scar running down his cheek and dark sunglasses covering his eyes, stepped in front of Martha. He was tall and broad, towering over her small frame. The other bikers stood behind him, smirking and nudging each other. Martha stopped and looked up at him. She said nothing. The biker grinned, showing yellow teeth. "Watch it, Grandma," he sneered, reaching out and knocking her walking stick aside with his boot. It clattered to the ground. His friends burst into laughter, their voices loud and harsh. One of them, a thin man with tattoos covering his arms, whistled. "Hey, maybe we should help her cross the street," he joked. Another biker, wearing a red bandana, leaned against his motorcycle. "Nah, she's fine," he said with a chuckle. "Old folks are tough. Ain't that right, lady?" Martha stood there for a moment. Her face didn't show fear, only calm patience. She bent down slowly, picking up her stick. Her hand trembled just a little, but her grip was firm. She dusted it off carefully, as if nothing had happened. Then she looked up at the scar-faced biker and spoke in a soft but steady voice. "You boys ought to be careful who you mess with." Her words were calm, almost gentle. But there was something in the way she said them that made a few of the bikers exchange uneasy glances. The leader, however, just laughed louder, his shoulders shaking. "Careful," he mocked, turning to his friends. "You hear that, boys? Grandma says we should be careful." He leaned in closer, his breath smelling of cigarettes and cheap beer. "What are you gonna do, hit me with your stick?" The laughter roared again, and a few townspeople across the street watched nervously. They wanted to step in, but no one dared. Martha simply stared at him, her lips curling into a faint smile. "No," she said softly. "Not yet." The biker leader raised an eyebrow, then shook his head. "Crazy old bat," he muttered, waving her off. "Come on, boys. Let's get outta here." One by one, the bikers revved their engines, filling the air with smoke and noise. They peeled out of the gas station, leaving behind the smell of burning rubber and a crowd of worried onlookers. Martha watched them go, her eyes following their every move. She sighed, tapping her stick lightly against the ground. Mr. Jenkins finally stepped outside his bakery and walked over. "Martha, you all right?" he asked, his voice full of concern. "I'm fine, Jenkins," Martha said, brushing off her dress. "They'll be back, though." Mrs. Thompson rolled down her window. "What do you mean? You think they'll come again?" Martha gave a small nod. "People like that always do." Jenkins shook his head. "This town's not safe anymore. What can we do?" Martha didn't answer right away. She gazed down the road where the bikers had disappeared, her fingers tapping the handle of her walking stick. Then, with a small smile, she looked back at Jenkins. "We'll see," she said simply, then turned and continued walking home. The other townspeople watched as she walked away, murmuring among themselves. Some were scared, others curious. But Martha Bell wasn't worried. As she made her way down the street, she thought about the past she had left behind. She had promised herself she was done with that life. She had left the danger, the chases, and the fights behind for a reason. But standing in front of those bikers, feeling the weight of their stares, she knew something deep inside her wasn't gone. Not yet. She gripped her walking stick tighter. It wasn't just a stick to help her walk. It was something more. Something she hoped she wouldn't have to use again. When Martha reached her small yellow house, she stepped inside and locked the door. She placed her groceries on the kitchen counter, then walked over to a wooden chest in the corner of the room. She knelt down, her knees creaking, and opened it. Inside were old photographs, newspaper clippings, and something wrapped carefully in cloth. Martha unwrapped it slowly, revealing a worn leather gun holster. Her fingers traced the edges, memories rushing back. She sighed and put it back. "Not yet," she whispered to herself. "Not yet." Outside, the town of Willow Creek was quiet once more. But Martha knew the quiet wouldn't last. The bikers would return, and when they did, they wouldn't be laughing. And when that time came, they would realize they had picked the wrong grandma to mess with. In the days that followed, the bikers didn't leave town. In fact, they became worse. They rode their loud motorcycles up and down the streets at all hours, scaring little children and making dogs bark. They hung around the gas station, tossing empty soda cans on the ground and glaring at anyone who walked by. People were afraid to say anything. Mr. Jenkins, the bakery owner, didn't speak up when they knocked over his flower pots outside his shop. Mrs. Thompson, who loved to take evening walks, stayed inside now. Even the sheriff seemed to look the other way whenever the bikers sped past the station. Martha, however, was not afraid. Every day, she walked through town like usual, carrying her grocery bag and using her walking stick. The bikers laughed when they saw her. "Look, it's Granny again," one of them shouted. Another biker, the one with the scar on his face, grinned and said, "Still think we should be careful, old lady." They laughed and laughed, but Martha only smiled and kept walking. She never argued, never looked angry. Instead, she watched them carefully. Her sharp eyes noticed everything: the way they parked their bikes, the tattoos on their arms, the way they always looked around before doing something bad. At night, when the town was quiet, Martha sat on her front porch with a small notebook in her lap. The light from the porch lamp cast a soft glow on her wrinkled face as she scribbled notes with an old pencil. "Scarface biker always stands with his back to the road," she wrote. "Tall one with the red bandana left-handed, keeps reaching into his jacket pocket." She wrote down their habits, their favorite spots in town, and the times they came and went. Each little note was a piece of a puzzle, and Martha was very good at puzzles. She had spent years learning how to observe people, how to wait, and how to strike at just the right moment. Martha's house looked like any other house in town, cozy and quiet. But inside, hidden away in a small wooden chest, were things no one in Willow Creek would believe belonged to an old lady like her. A dusty pair of binoculars, an old radio, and a few worn maps. And, of course, her walking stick. Everyone in town thought it was just to help her walk, but Martha knew the truth. Inside that simple wooden cane was something much more dangerous. A sharp blade, hidden so well that no one would suspect it. She hadn't used it in many years, but she still remembered how. One evening, as Martha sat on her porch writing in her notebook, she heard the familiar roar of motorcycles. The bikers were back, and this time they stopped in front of her house. Scarface and a few others walked up to her gate, smirking. "What cha writing, Granny?" Scarface sneered. "A letter to your knitting club." Martha looked up slowly and smiled. "Just making a list," she said. The bikers chuckled. "A list of what?" "How to bake cookies." Martha shook her head. "No. A list of mistakes people make when they underestimate others." The smile never left her face, but her eyes, sharp and steady, made Scarface shift uncomfortably. He didn't say anything else. Instead, he spat on the ground and turned back to his motorcycle. As they rode away, Martha sighed and tapped her walking stick lightly on the porch floor. "Fools," she whispered to herself. Later that night, Martha stood in her small kitchen, staring out the window. The street was empty now, but she knew it wouldn't stay that way. She could feel something coming, something she hadn't felt in years. She walked over to the wooden chest in the corner of her room and knelt down. Her old knees creaked, but she didn't mind. She opened the chest and carefully took out the walking stick. Slowly, she twisted the handle, and with a soft click, the hidden blade slid out. It was sharp. Sharp as the day she had last used it. Martha stared at it for a long moment, her fingers running along the edge. She didn't want to go back to that life. She had left it behind for a reason. But now, trouble had come knocking on her door, and Martha Bell wasn't the kind of woman to ignore it. Placing the stick back together, she stood up straight and looked in the mirror. The woman staring back at her wasn't just an old widow from Willow Creek. No, she was someone much more. Someone who knew how to handle trouble. And trouble had no idea what it was dealing with. The next morning, Martha went into town as usual. She stopped at the diner for a cup of tea and listened to the people whispering. "Did you hear what the bikers did at the hardware store?" Mr. Jenkins asked. "They scared poor old Mr. Porter half to death," Mrs. Thompson replied. Martha sipped her tea quietly, saying nothing. She simply smiled and listened. That afternoon, as the sun set and the shadows grew longer, Martha sat on her porch once again, notebook in hand, and watched. She wasn't going to wait forever. She was just waiting for the right moment. Because Martha Bell knew something the bikers didn't. They thought she was just an old lady. But they were wrong. Climax and big reveal. The bikers' recklessness finally escalated when they tried to rob the local diner. As they threatened the owner, Martha stepped inside, her grocery bag hanging from her arm. "Get lost, old lady," one of them growled, but Martha didn't budge. Instead, she placed the bag on the counter, reached for her walking stick, and twisted the handle. In a blur, the blade gleamed in the fluorescent light. The bikers froze as Martha's stance shifted, years of training coming back like second nature. "You really should have listened when I said to be careful," she said, her voice steady. The fight was swift. Martha moved with precision, disarming and incapacitating each biker in moments. They barely had time to react before finding themselves on the floor, groaning in pain. Minutes after the fight, the sheriff's car pulled up outside the diner. The red and blue lights flashed across the street, and the sound of the siren slowly faded. Sheriff Wilkins, a tall man with a thick mustache and a round belly, stepped out of the car. He adjusted his belt and looked around in shock. Lined up against the diner wall were the bikers, once tough and scary, now bruised, groaning, and handcuffed. Scarface, their leader, had a swollen lip, and the others looked just as bad. Some had torn jackets, and all of them had their heads down, avoiding eye contact with the townsfolk who had gathered to watch. Sheriff Wilkins walked over to Martha, his boots clicking against the pavement. He scratched his head, his eyes wide. "Did you really?" he asked, staring at her in disbelief. Martha stood calmly, her grocery bag still hanging on her arm. Her walking stick was back to looking like an ordinary cane, the hidden blade safely tucked away inside. She gave a small shrug and smiled. "They were asking for it," she said simply. The sheriff blinked, looking at the row of beaten bikers, then back at Martha. "Martha, you're telling me you did this?" Martha nodded, wiping a bit of dust off her sleeve. "Just call their headquarters," she said in a calm voice. "Tell them to stay out of Willow Creek." The sheriff let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be," he turned to his deputies, who were busy loading the bikers into the police cars. "Get them down to the station," he ordered. As the bikers were being dragged away, Scarface glared at Martha one last time. "You'll regret this, lady," he muttered. Martha smiled sweetly and tapped her walking stick against the ground. "I don't think so, dear," she said, her voice steady. Scarface swallowed hard and looked away. The crowd of townspeople had gathered closer now. They whispered among themselves, their faces filled with a mix of awe and amazement. Mr. Jenkins, the baker, stepped forward, his eyes wide. "Martha," he said slowly, "I don't think any of us really knew you." Mrs. Thompson, still holding her newspaper tightly, nodded. "All this time, we thought you were just a quiet old lady," she said. Martha chuckled. "I am a quiet old lady," she said, giving them a small wink. "Most of the time." The crowd laughed nervously, but their eyes were filled with newfound respect. No one would ever look at Martha the same way again. "You saved us, Mr. Perry," the diner owner said, shaking his head. "We were all too scared to do anything, but you just walked right in and took care of them." Martha patted his hand gently. "Sometimes, you just need to remind people to behave," she said. Sheriff Wilkins crossed his arms. "Remind them." "Martha, you took down a whole gang. You could have gotten hurt." Martha smiled softly. "I can take care of myself, Sheriff," she replied. "And I couldn't let them ruin our little town." A little boy standing next to his mother tugged at her sleeve. "Mom, is Martha a superhero?" he whispered. Martha heard him and chuckled. She knelt down to his level and said, "No, sweetie. Just an old lady who knows a few tricks." She winked, and the boy grinned up at her in awe. As the sheriff's car drove away with the bikers inside, the townspeople slowly started clapping. First, it was a small clap from Mrs. Thompson, then Mr. Jenkins joined in, and soon the whole crowd was applauding. Some people even cheered. Martha felt a small blush rise in her cheeks. All right," she said, waving her hand. "Let's not make a fuss." Mr. Perry stepped forward again, holding a warm slice of pie on a plate. "Martha, this one's on the house," he said with a smile. "You deserve it." Martha took the pie and smiled. "Thank you, Perry," she said. "I do love a good slice of pie." As the crowd slowly started to head back to their homes, people kept sneaking glances at Martha, whispering to each other. Some of them shook their heads, still trying to believe what they had seen. Martha, however, just walked home like it was any other day. She held her pie in one hand and used her walking stick in the other. The street lights flickered on, casting a warm glow on the sidewalk. When she reached her small yellow house, she stepped onto the porch and took a deep breath. The night air was cool, and the town was quiet again just the way she liked it. She sat down on her rocking chair and took a bite of her pie. As she chewed, she looked down at her walking stick, gently running her fingers along its smooth surface. "I guess I still got it," she whispered to herself with a small smile. The stars twinkled above, and the town of Willow Creek slept peacefully once again. Thanks to Martha Bell, the quiet old lady who was anything but ordinary. And from that day on, no one in Willow Creek ever looked at her the same way again. Martha walked home slowly, her footsteps light against the quiet streets of Willow Creek. The town was peaceful now, just the way it used to be before the bikers arrived. The street lights glowed softly, casting long shadows on the pavement. The cool evening breeze brushed against her face, and she could hear the distant chirping of crickets. She held her walking stick firmly, tapping it gently against the ground with each step. To anyone watching, she looked like just an old lady going home after a long day. But Martha knew better.